For the past few weeks, we've talked about invaders, armies, conquerors, colonizers, people who used force to take what they wanted. We've seen how they broke statues with hammers and chisels, trying to erase a history that didn't fit their narrative. But what happens when the weapon isn't a tool you can hold in your hand? What happens when the weapon is an idea? Ideas can be far more powerful and last much longer than stone. And sometimes, a single idea can erase more history than any army ever could. This is the story of how a dangerous idea, born in the halls of European academia, tried to rewrite the identity of an entire civilization. It's the story of scientific racism and its attempt to steal Egypt's heritage. In the 18th and 19th centuries, as European powers expanded their empires, they needed a way to justify their dominance over other peoples. They turned to science, or rather, a twisted version of it. Thinkers like Christoph Minners and later, Samuel George Morton began creating racial hierarchies. They measured skulls, analyzed features, and created a ladder of humanity with white Europeans conveniently placed at the very top. Everyone else, Asians, Native Americans, and especially Africans, were placed on the rungs below, deemed intellectually and culturally inferior. This wasn't just abstract theory. It had real-world consequences. It was the intellectual fuel for colonialism, slavery, and systemic oppression. And ancient Egypt presented a huge problem for this worldview. Here was this incredible civilization that predated Greece and Rome, with monumental architecture, complex writing, and advanced knowledge of science and mathematics. European scholars were in awe, but they were also deeply uncomfortable. How could a civilization this great have emerged from Africa, the continent they had labeled as primitive? Their solution was simple and insidious. They decided the ancient Egyptians couldn't have been African. They argued that a superior race, perhaps from Asia or even Europe, must have migrated into the Nile Valley, bringing civilization with them. They claimed the pharaohs and the architects of the pyramids were not native Africans, but a foreign ruling class. This Semitic hypothesis became the dominant theory. Egyptologists and anthropologists selectively used evidence to support it. They pointed to lighter-skinned figures in some tomb paintings, while ignoring the vast majority that depicted a range of brown skin tones, clearly representing the diversity of the Nile Valley. They misinterpreted texts and ignored the Egyptians' own descriptions of themselves and their neighbors. They effectively created a fictional Egypt, one that was geographically in Africa, but racially and culturally detached from it. This wasn't just an academic debate. It was an act of cultural theft on a massive scale. By decoupling Egypt from its African roots, they denied black people a crucial part of their heritage and reinforced the racist idea that Africa had no history of its own. This false narrative was taught in universities and museums for generations, shaping how the world saw Egypt and how Africa saw itself. It was a weaponized idea, and it did more damage to Egypt's identity than any hammer ever could. But ideas, like empires, can also fall. Picture this. It's the late 1800s, rolling into the early 1900s. Europe is a continent in massive upheaval. Factories are roaring to life, their smokestacks painting the skies gray. Cities are exploding with new people, new money, and new ambitions. European empires are stretching their tentacles across the globe, especially into Africa, carving up the continent piece by piece. But amidst all this industrial and colonial frenzy, another power is rising. A new voice of authority that people are starting to trust more than anyone else. It's not the voice of priests from the pulpit. It's not the commands of kings from their thrones. It's the calm, measured voice of scientists, professors, anthropologists, men in sharp suits, clutching notebooks and measuring tools. These were the new high priests of knowledge. Their mantra was simple and powerful. We follow evidence. We follow facts. We follow reason. It sounds completely trustworthy, doesn't it? How could you argue with facts? But here's the dark secret, the twist in the story. Even science, that beacon of objectivity, can be warped by human bias. Even meticulous research can be manipulated to serve the powerful. And even the most respected experts can tell lies, especially when their reputations, their funding, and their entire careers depend on protecting one very specific, very convenient story. A story that justified colonialism and erased the true history of the people they conquered. These scientists went to Egypt, A land with a history so grand it was almost mythical. They saw the pyramids, the Sphinx, the temples, and they were faced with a puzzle that challenged their entire worldview. How could a civilization this advanced, this magnificent, have been built by Africans? In their minds, steeped in the racial hierarchies of the time, it was simply impossible. So, they invented a new story, a false narrative. They created a new race, a brown or a Mediterranean race, specifically for the ancient Egyptians. They claimed these people were not truly African, but a separate group, closer to Europeans. They took measurements of skulls, analyzed mummies, and published papers all to prove a conclusion they had decided on from the very beginning. They weren't following the evidence. They were twisting it to fit their prejudice. This wasn't just an academic debate. This was an act of cultural theft on a massive scale. By denying Egypt its African identity, they were denying Africa one of its greatest legacies. They rewrote history to make it fit their narrative of superiority. The real story of Egypt, a story of a powerful, innovative, and deeply African civilization, was buried under layers of biased science. And for over a century, the world believed their lie. It's a powerful reminder that we must always question who is telling the story and why. Have you ever wondered why for so long the incredible achievements of ancient Egypt were separated from Africa? The answer is a story, a very specific and carefully protected story that Europe wanted to tell the world. The story was simple. Europe equals civilization, and Africa equals primitive. That was the belief. That was the assumption. And most importantly, that was the very foundation of colonial rule. Because think about it for a second. If Africa had great civilizations, if Africa built pyramids that touched the sky, if Africa mastered astronomy and charted the stars, if Africa ruled powerful empires that stretched for thousands of miles, then colonialism has no moral excuse. The entire justification, the whole idea of a civilizing mission in Africa, just completely collapses. So, they couldn't allow that narrative to take hold. They couldn't accept it, even when the evidence was literally staring them in the face. Even when the magnificent statues were looking back at them. Even when the monuments they unearthed were taller than their own grandest cathedrals. They couldn't accept the truth. They needed a different explanation. Any explanation, as long as it wasn't the obvious one. They twisted facts, invented theories, and went to extraordinary lengths to suggest that ancient Egyptians weren't African. They proposed they were from Asia, from Europe, from some mythical lost white race anywhere, but Africa. This wasn't just a simple mistake. It was a deliberate act of historical erasure. It was what we now call scientific racism, using the language of science to justify prejudice. They measured skulls, analyzed features, and created complex racial hierarchies, all designed to do one thing: disconnect Egypt from its African roots. This allowed them to claim Egypt's legacy for themselves while simultaneously denying the genius of the African continent. This campaign to rewrite history was incredibly successful, and its effects are still felt today. It created a false image of Africa as a continent without history, a land waiting to be discovered and civilized. But the truth is, Africa has always been a continent of innovators, kings, queens, and scholars. By erasing Egypt's blackness, they were trying to erase Africa's greatness. But history has a way of fighting back. Today, thanks to the tireless work of historians, archaeologists, and scholars, especially those of African descent, we are reclaiming that truth. We're challenging the old, racist narratives and piecing together the real story of ancient Egypt, a story of a powerful, innovative, and profoundly African civilization. Understanding this history isn't just about correcting the past. It's about shaping a more honest and equitable future. So this is what they did. They invented something called scientific racism. Now, hear that phrase carefully. Scientific racism. Two words that should never, ever belong together, but for decades, they did. European scientists and thinkers started ranking humans, literally ranking them, as if people were different species of animals, as if humanity had levels. It's a shocking concept today, but it was mainstream then. And who do you think they placed at the very top of this made-up ladder? Europeans, of course. In their narrative, they were the pinnacle of civilization, in the middle of they put Asians and Middle Easterners. and at the very bottom, Africans. This was the hierarchy they taught in universities, printed in textbooks, and published in prestigious scientific journals. It was presented as fact, not opinion. This wasn't some fringe theory. It was the academic consensus of the time, taught to generations of students across the Western world. And once an idea enters textbooks, once it's taught by professors with fancy degrees, it starts to feel like truth. Even when it's complete and utter nonsense, it becomes ingrained, accepted, a part of the cultural furniture. This dangerous idea was used to justify colonialism, to rationalize oppression, and to steal the heritage of entire civilizations. Because if you can convince the world that a group of people is less than, you can justify doing almost anything to them. Now, how does this all connect to ancient Egypt? Well, this is where the story gets even more twisted. The great civilization of the pharaohs, with its pyramids, its advanced mathematics, its incredible art was undeniably African. It was built on the African continent by African people. But for the European scholars of the 19th century, this was a problem. It didn't fit their racist hierarchy. How could people they placed at the bottom create something so magnificent they couldn't accept it? It broke their entire worldview, so they had to invent a new story. They had to rewrite history. They argued, with absolutely no evidence, that the ancient Egyptians couldn't have been black Africans. They must have been from somewhere else. Maybe they were a lost white race, or migrants from Asia, or ebon aliens, anything but black and African. They looked at the statues and tomb paintings, and even when the features were clearly African, they explained them away. They measured skulls, a practice called cranometry, twisting the data to fit their preconceived conclusions. This was a deliberate campaign to disconnect Egypt from its African roots. They effectively stole a legacy, erasing a black civilization from history to uphold their racist ideology. For more than a century, this false narrative was the dominant story told in museums, documentaries, and classrooms all over the world. It was a lie, born from scientific racism, that shaped how we all saw the ancient world. But history has a way of revealing the truth. Picture an old, dimly lit laboratory. Sunlight struggles through grimy windows, catching dust motes, dancing in the air. On long wooden tables, a macabre collection is laid out in neat, unsettling rows. Human skulls. Beside them, an array of measuring tools, gleaming calipers, worn tape measures. Men in starched collars lean over these bones, their faces a mixture of intense focus and cold detachment. They are meticulously measuring the circumference of a head, the precise angle of a forehead, the width of a nasal bridge. They jot down numbers in leather-bound notebooks, as if they're solving a complex mathematical equation. This practice had a name: cranometry, and its purpose was chilling. They claimed they were measuring skulls to objectively prove intelligence, to scientifically rank human worth. Their goal was to demonstrate that some races were naturally superior, more advanced, while others were inherently inferior. But here's the crucial twist in this so-called scientific endeavor. The conclusion was already written before a single measurement was taken. The entire process was a sham. They cherry-picked data, manipulated measurements, and ignored any results that contradicted their preconceived biases. If a skull from a supposedly inferior race was larger than one from a superior race, they would claim it was an anomaly or invent a reason, like brain disease, to exclude the Italiano. This wasn't science. It was theater. It was a performance designed to lend an air of legitimacy to deeply ingrained prejudice. The numbers were just props, pretending to be objective truth. The entire field was built on a foundation of lies, designed to justify colonialism, slavery, and systemic oppression. They were attempting to use the language of science to codify racism, to make bigotry look like a fact of nature. And this wasn't just some forgotten chapter of history. The legacy of these false narratives echoes even today. Think about ancient Egypt. For a long time, many of these same pseudoscientists refused to believe that native Africans could have built such a magnificent civilization. So, they invented stories. They claimed the ancient Egyptians must have been a different, non-African race, perhaps from the Near East or Europe, who came and created the pyramids and temples. They pointed to statues and tomb paintings, twisting the art to fit their narrative. ignoring the clear evidence right in front of them. It was a deliberate attempt to erase a people's history, to steal their heritage and rewrite their identity, to fit a racist worldview. The truth is, ancient Egypt was a diverse, powerful, and unequivocally African civilization. The evidence from genetics, archaeology, and historical records all points to this. Recognizing the truth isn't about replacing one story with another. It's about dismantling the old lies that were built on prejudice and restoring the integrity of history. It's about acknowledging the incredible achievements of all peoples without the tainted filter of scientific racism. So let's go back a few centuries. Imagine a group of European scholars, men of science and reason, who are absolutely convinced of one thing: that people of African descent are inherently inferior. This wasn't just a casual prejudice. It was a deeply ingrained, so-called scientific belief. They built entire academic frameworks around it, published papers, and taught it in universities. They believed that intelligence, creativity, and the ability to build great civilizations were exclusive to their own race. It was a neat, self-serving little theory that justified colonialism, slavery, and all sorts of injustice. It made them feel secure in their position at the top of the world. Now, guess what happens when these same men, so sure of their theories, walk into Egypt? Imagine their shock. They're standing in front of pyramids that are thousands of years older than the Parthenon in Greece. They're gazing up at colossal statues of powerful pharaohs, figures with distinctly African features. They're trying to comprehend how these inferior people, as their theories claimed, could have built architectural wonders that even modern engineering struggles to replicate. The sheer scale, precision, and artistry of ancient Egypt was a direct, undeniable contradiction to everything they believed. Their entire worldview, their scientific racism, was suddenly standing on very shaky ground. It just didn't add up. So what do you do when the facts punch a giant hole in your favorite theory? The logical, scientific thing to do would be to admit you were wrong. Throw out the old theory and start over based on the new evidence. But that would mean admitting that their entire social and racial hierarchy was a lie. That was a pill too bitter to swallow. So, instead of fixing the theory, they decided to attack the evidence, not by tearing down the pyramids, of course, but by rewriting the story. They launched an intellectual assault on history itself. They couldn't deny the greatness of ancient Egypt, so they decided to steal it. They invented a new, incredibly convenient idea called the Hamitic hypothesis. This theory proposed that, yes, ancient Egypt was a magnificent civilization, but it wasn't built by black Africans. Oh no. According to them, it was created by a branch of the Caucasian race, a dark-skinned, but not Negroid people. But they called the Hamites. These Hamites, they claimed, swept down into Africa from somewhere in Asia or Europe, brought civilization to the true Africans, built the pyramids, ruled as pharaohs, and then mysteriously vanished or were absorbed, leaving behind their incredible achievements. It was a complete fabrication, a historical fantasy designed for one purpose: to keep their racist theories intact, even in the face of overwhelming evidence to the contrary. Have you ever heard of the Hamitic hypothesis? It sounds like some old, dusty theory, but its impact has been incredibly destructive. Basically, it was a so-called scientific idea that claimed if anything advanced or impressive existed in Africa, it couldn't possibly have been built by native Africans, never by black Africans. It had to be outsiders. So, who were these mysterious outsiders? Well, the theory invented a fictional group of people they called Hamites. These were supposedly a superior race that swept into Africa from somewhere else, maybe Asia or Europe, and brought civilization to the supposedly uncivilized black populations. They taught them how to build, how to govern, how to create art. Let that sink in for a moment. Instead of acknowledging the genius and innovation of African peoples, they literally invented an entire imaginary race just to avoid giving credit where it was due. This wasn't just some fringe idea. It became a cornerstone of colonial era thinking. It was used to justify European control and exploitation. Think about ancient Egypt, when early European explorers saw the pyramids, the Sphinx, and the temples. Their minds couldn't reconcile these incredible feats of engineering with their prejudiced views of black Africans. So, what did they do? They applied the Hamitic hypothesis. They argued that the ancient Egyptians couldn't have been black Africans. They had to be a branch of this mythical Hamitic race, somehow separate and superior to the people living around them. This created a false narrative that severed Egypt from its African roots. It was a deliberate attempt to rewrite history, to steal a legacy. They measured skulls, analyzed statues with biased eyes, and twisted evidence to fit their preconceived notions. They pointed to certain statues and claimed they had European features, conveniently ignoring the vast amount of evidence to the contrary. Written descriptions from ancient Greeks like Herodotus and modern genetic studies that connect ancient Egyptians to other Northeast African populations. The Hamitic hypothesis is a textbook example of scientific racism. It shows how far people will go, how much they will twist logic and deny reality, just to uphold a system of racial hierarchy. This wasn't about finding the truth. It was about maintaining power. By denying that black Africans were capable of building one of the world's most foundational civilizations, they tried to justify centuries of oppression. But history is being reclaimed. Scholars and researchers are dismantling these old lies, proving that ancient Egypt was, and always will be, a magnificent African civilization. For centuries, a question has lingered over one of history's most magnificent civilizations. Who were the ancient Egyptians? The answer should be simple, right? Egypt is in Africa. But for a very long time, the narrative was twisted, contorted, and rewritten to fit a deeply biased worldview. The prevailing theory, pushed for generations, was that ancient Egyptians couldn't possibly be African. They had to be something else. This idea, rooted in scientific racism, desperately tried to disconnect Egypt from its own continent. Scholars and historians would claim they were Near Eastern, or maybe Mediterranean. The term Caucasian was thrown around a lot. Essentially, they could be anything except black African. This was a deliberate effort to claim the glories of ancient Egypt, its pyramids, its science, its art for a non-African heritage. It was a story built not on evidence, but on prejudice. A story that said incredible achievements couldn't have come from the African continent. But the evidence, if you actually look at it, tells a very different story. Geographically, Egypt is undeniably in Africa. Historically, it had deep, profound connections with its southern neighbor, Nubia, a civilization recognized for its powerful black African kingdoms. The two cultures were intertwined, sharing trade, traditions, and even dynasties. You can see it right there in the art. Look closely at the statues, the tomb paintings, the reliefs. You'll find features that are unmistakably African. Full lips, broad noses, and diverse skin tones ranging from light brown to deep black. Who's like you'd find across the continent today. They weren't trying to hide who they were. They were depicting themselves. The most powerful evidence, however, has come from modern science. Recent DNA studies on ancient Egyptian mummies have started to paint a clearer picture. And guess what? They confirm substantial sub-Saharan African ancestry. The genetic links to populations in East and West Africa are undeniable. The science is finally catching up to what the geographies, the art, and common sense have been telling us all along. So why the desperate attempt to deny this reality? It boils down to pride and prejudice. The colonial era mindset couldn't accept that a black African civilization could be the architect of such genius. Admitting the truth would have shattered the racist foundations that justified exploitation and colonialism. So they created a fantasy, a historical fiction, where Egypt was an island of non-Africans in the middle of Africa. It's a powerful reminder of how false narratives can be constructed to serve an agenda, and how vital it is to question the histories we've been taught and seek the truth for ourselves. Think about it for a second. If you spend your entire life hearing things like, ancient Egypt wasn't really African, or Egyptians were a separate, unique race, or the classic, well, their race is uncertain. Then suddenly all those broken noses on the statues start to make a twisted kind of sense. They serve a new purpose. They help sell a lie, because now people can look at these incredible artifacts and just shrugged, saying, see, we can't really tell what they looked like. And that's the point. That manufactured uncertainty is convenient, a little too convenient, don't you think? It allows a false narrative to take root and grow, overshadowing the truth. This wasn't just a physical act of vandalism. It evolved. It became academic. It became cultural. It became psychological. The goal was never just to break stone. It was to break our confidence, to break the connection between a people and their heritage. They systematically created a narrative that made generations of African children and children of the diaspora grow up with a profound sense of emptiness, thinking, we didn't build anything great. We didn't invent anything important. We never led world-changing civilizations. Can you even begin to imagine how devastating that is? To be taught to believe that your ancestors contributed nothing of significance, that their story is one of absence and not achievement. When in reality, their greatness didn't just exist. It fundamentally shaped the world we live in today. From mathematics and architecture to medicine and philosophy, the foundations were laid in the Nile Valley. So, let's call this what it really is. This isn't just misinformation or a historical debate. This is a deliberate, calculated act of identity theft on a global scale. It's the theft of a legacy, the theft of pride, and the theft of truth. For centuries, this theft was supported by something called scientific racism. This was a pseudoscience used by European thinkers during the colonial era to create a hierarchy of races, with themselves conveniently at the top. They looked at the monumental achievements of ancient Egypt, the pyramids, the complex writing systems, the advanced astronomy, and they simply couldn't accept that black Africans were responsible. It didn't fit their prejudiced worldview, so they invented theories to explain it away. They claimed the Egyptians were a lost white race, maybe from Atlantis, or Caucasians who migrated into Africa. They meticulously measured skulls and analyzed features through a biased lens, all to prove a predetermined conclusion: that greatness could not come from Africa. This academic dishonesty seeped into museums, textbooks, and documentaries. Think about the classic Hollywood depictions of Egyptians. They are almost never portrayed by actors of African descent. Cleopatra, Nefertiti, the great pharaohs there, shown with European features, reinforcing the lie that Egypt is somehow separate from the African continent it is firmly a part of. This isn't an accident. It's the visual legacy of that same identity theft. Every time a statue's features are described as ambiguous, or a mummy's DNA is interpreted through a Eurocentric framework, that theft continues. But here's the powerful part. Truth has a way of enduring. The evidence has always been there, written in their own words and depicted on their own temple walls. The ancient Egyptians called their land Kemet, which means the Black Land, a reference to the rich, dark soil of the Nile, but also a reflection of how they saw themselves. Greek historians, the so-called fathers of Western thought like Herodotus, traveled to Egypt and described the people they met. They didn't mince words. They described the Egyptians as having dark skin and woolly hair. They compared them to the Ethiopians. There was no ambiguity in their eyes. The linguistic evidence is also undeniable. The ancient Egyptian language belongs to the Afro-Asiatic language family, with its closest relatives found in Northeast Africa. The culture, the spiritual beliefs, the artistic traditions, they all have deep roots in the African continent. This wasn't an alien civilization that crash-landed in Africa. It was a civilization that grew out of Africa, by Africans, for Africans. Acknowledging this isn't about rewriting history. It's about correcting a historical record that was deliberately falsified. It's about restoring a stolen legacy. So why does this matter so much today? Because representation is not just a buzzword. It's about seeing your potential reflected in the stories of the past. When a child learns that their ancestors mapped the stars, developed written language, and built wonders that still baffle engineers today, it ignites a spark. It replaces a narrative of lack with a legacy of genius. It dismantles the psychological chains of inferiority that were forged over centuries of lies. Reclaiming the African identity of ancient Egypt is an act of empowerment. It's a statement that says, we were there, we were leaders, we were innovators, and that same greatness, that same brilliance, still flows within us today. It's time to stop letting them get away with the greatest identity theft in human history. The truth is our birthright. But here's the beautiful thing about truth. It waits. It survives. It refuses to die. For centuries, a story was told about ancient Egypt, a story crafted not from evidence, but from prejudice. A story that tried to erase the identity of a civilization, to paint it in a color that fit a false narrative. They used what they called science, but it was just bias dressed up in a lab coat. They measured skulls, they analyzed art through a distorted lens, and they twisted history to fit their agenda. They wanted to claim this incredible legacy, to disconnect it from its true African roots. They literally chiseled away at the features of statues, trying to physically alter the past. It was a systematic effort to rewrite history, to build a lie so big it might just become the truth. But truth has a way of holding on, because eventually, real science shows up. Not the biased pseudoscience of the past, but the rigorous, evidence-based science of today. Genetics, archaeology, carbon dating, linguistics. These aren't just fancy words. They are tools of truth. They are keys that unlock the past as it actually was, not as some wanted it to be. Evidence that can't be twisted so easily. And suddenly, the old lies start cracking, just like those statues. Except this time, the cracks reveal the truth underneath. Modern genetics has allowed us to analyze the DNA of ancient mummies, connecting them directly to modern North and East African populations. It's not a theory anymore. It's written in the very code of life. Archaeological discoveries continue to unearth artifacts that scream of their African origins, from pottery styles to burial customs. Carbon dating places these finds squarely in their timeline, leaving no room for doubt. And linguistics, the study of language, traces the roots of the ancient Egyptian language deep into the Afroasiatic family tree. Each discovery is a hammer blow to the crumbling wall of falsehoods. The narrative is changing, not because of opinion, but because of facts. The people who built the pyramids, who created this magnificent civilization, are finally having their true story told. It's a story of an African people, brilliant and innovative. It's a reminder that history belongs to everyone, and no one has the right to steal it. The real science, the real evidence, is putting the pieces back together, restoring a picture that was deliberately broken. The truth was always there, waiting patiently under layers of lies, and now it's shining through. So, we've peeled back the layers on this long, complicated story. We started with the ancient conquerors, the first to impose their will on Egypt's legacy. Then, we moved into the colonial era, where museums became vaults for plundered artifacts, their labels telling stories that served the empires, not the truth. And finally, we uncovered the ugly chapter of scientific racism, where fake science was used to systematically erase the true identity of the ancient Egyptians, twisting their image to fit a prejudiced worldview. But even after exposing all of that, one crucial piece of the puzzle remains, because this isn't just ancient history we're talking about. It's happening right now, in our modern times. The statues are still housed in foreign museums, thousands of miles from their homeland. The labels are still misleading, perpetuating the old, false narratives. The heritage of an entire civilization remains fragmented and separated from its people. So, the biggest question is, what happens next? Who gets to tell the real story of ancient Egypt now? And how do we even begin to reclaim what was deliberately erased? That's where we're heading in the final part of this journey. This is no longer just about understanding the past. It's about actively shaping the future. It's a story of restoration, of return, and ultimately, of reclaiming the true face of history. Stay with us as we explore the fight for justice and the powerful movement to bring Egypt's heritage home. Thanks for watching, and don't forget to subscribe and like this video. Explore African History Relived channel for more of deep dives. So, we've peeled back the layers on this long, complicated story. We started with the ancient conquerors, the first to impose their will on Egypt's legacy. Then, we moved into the colonial era, where museums became vaults for plundered artifacts, their labels telling stories that served the empires, not the truth. And finally, we uncovered the ugly chapter of scientific racism, where fake science was used to systematically erase the true identity of the ancient Egyptians, twisting their image to fit a prejudiced worldview. But even after exposing all of that, one crucial piece of the puzzle remains, because this isn't just ancient history we're talking about. It's happening right now, in our modern times. The statues are still housed in foreign museums, thousands of miles from their homeland. The labels are still misleading, perpetuating the old, false narratives. The heritage of an entire civilization remains fragmented and separated from its people. So, The biggest question is, what happens next? Who gets to tell the real story of ancient Egypt now? And how do we even begin to reclaim what was deliberately erased? That's where we're heading in the final part of this journey. This is no longer just about understanding the past. It's about actively shaping the future. It's a story of restoration, of return, and ultimately, of reclaiming the true face of history. Stay with us as we explore the fight for justice and the powerful movement to bring Egypt's heritage home.